Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Rebecca Rennie, Marketing Coordinator at Wealth Engine, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled, Why Wealth Screening Matters in Annual Giving. I am pleased to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Linda Garrison, CFRE, Senior Consultant at Wealth Engine, and Doug Cogswell, President and CEO of Advisor Solutions. Thank you all for joining us today. Now I will turn it over to you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So Linda and I are going to kind of go through why annual giving matters, some of the key drivers behind success, some of the strategy issues, and then dive into an execution plan and kind of tie in using the data that you have and then bringing in wealth screening to it. So it should be a fairly comprehensive back and forth between the two of us. But just to get started, there's the kind of three key things that annual giving does. The first is it's a source of revenue, and in many cases it's a major source of continuing revenue for the school, the nonprofit, the healthcare fundraiser. But secondly, it's also a key to attachment, also known as engagement or affinity. So we do a lot of work in this area, and we're trying to understand what causes people to be more connected to an organization, and that connection will cause them to participate more, to give more, to step up to major giving, all of that. And every time we do this research, whether it's in higher ed or healthcare or not-for-profits, consistency in annual giving makes a huge difference. It's usually one of the top 2 or 3 factors. The other things are, for example, event attendance, newsletter click-throughs, reunions in a higher ed institution. But getting somebody to give consistently and step up their giving over time is key to going further. And the third thing is cultivation towards eventual major giving. So as you're looking at attachment and engaging people, there's a different things you can do, but clearly getting consistency in giving makes a lot of difference. So as we move on, there's tactical and strategic considerations and how to message and how to connect with people. So on the left, you obviously have a lot of prospects. They could be alumni, they could be recent patients, they could be members of an organization. Going to the top, the key thing to get this to work is to figure out what their interest areas are and how to message into that. There's a variety of ways of doing that. You can call out of what things they click through on your newsletters, what kinds of events they come to, but you're looking at using data and conversation to understand interest areas so you can create messaging around that. And today, there's print mechanisms where you can customize messaging to specific groups or individuals even. Obviously with email you can do that, phone as well. So there's a lot better and more ways to customize the message. Over on the right, different people respond in different ways, different age groups respond in different ways. So there's some balance of phone and print and personalized letters and email that will work, and maybe some balance between them. And going to the bottom, the timing of the messaging. Some people typically give at the end of the year around tax season. Other people may give typically in June because it's your fiscal year end, but understanding that and figuring out the patterns of giving is important. And the other issue of timing is getting the messages in around that, but also getting the right numbers of messages. As we go through this, we often see organizations that blanket people with way too many touch points. They're hitting them like several times a month. So that might be, we see cases of 50, 60, 70 touches a year. That's actually not good. It's much better to have 6 to 12 well-messaged, targeted touches around driving towards the time when people are more naturally likely to give. So that cycle, as you get that right, and it strengthens your prospects, they increase their giving, they become more regular. And if you get it right, you can understand the characteristics of your current donors and then use that to go out and segment non-donors to bring in more, which is a lot of what the rest of this is about.
Yeah, Doug, I think what you're saying, if I could, is that one size does not fit all when it comes to messaging to your donors. Would that be right?
Yeah, totally. And if we go to the next slide, I mean, that's one of the big differences between an average organization and, we do a lot of analytics and strategy work in this area. We often see the left side versus the right side. So the left side, there's a top line focus. It's on revenue or it's on overall participation. You tend to send the same message to everyone. It's generic messages. It's about the year end, or it's about some fall campaign or something. There's a generic ask amount. We'll talk about this a bit more in a few minutes, but it's like $150. Well, some people could give $1,500, $5,000, $25, but the messages all come out the same. Little or no metrics underneath the top line and very little experimentation. Part of the experimentation is I have a group of people with a set of characteristics. I try different media types, different messaging, which one works best, and then drop the ones that don't and do more of the ones that do. But often in what we see is it's the same mail piece to everybody over and over again. On the right, the top performers, instead of this top line, they have more strategic metrics. We'll get into what they tend to be in a few minutes. But they segment prospects. Not all non-donors are the same. Some are, they look like the donors and are targets. Some are sort of in a middle category. Maybe they give, and some are highly unlikely to be. So if you segment the prospects into different groups and align the messaging, and it can be interest areas. We have one client, a large state school, well known, that segments into their interest areas, which is athletics. The football program and the baseball program are really well known. Others are going to get messages around arts and humanities. Others are going to get it around sciences, and they have a whole social justice track, which others get messages around. So understanding that and targeting the messages that way really helps. And the customized ask, this is part of our partnership with Wealth Engine, because so many times it's a generic ask to everybody. And some people will easily give $5,000, and if you ask them for 50, they might actually feel unknown, or they might feel almost disrespected. So getting that right, it's not only a revenue thing, but it's building loyalty, because you feel the prospect feels like they're known better than tracking the metrics and then testing and adjusting. So not just doing the same thing over and over again, but trying stuff, trying the messages, adjusting it, all of that. Now, Linda, you might want to speak into this a little bit more, because you see this all the time, I know, as well.
Absolutely. So, and thanks, Doug. Those are great comments. And we were talking before the webinar actually about Doug's own experience with a particular ask that was very generic and very blah, and what his personal response to that was. You want to mention that at all?
Yeah, this guy got, it was a mail card, well produced, it worked, he opened it, it was attractive, cost some money, and then it was just a general thing about the program and the 150 years of the school. And this was a person who lives in a very wealthy zip code, classes of the 70s, so has been out a while in the power alley of his career, has been on a variety of boards, so this all should have been known. He opened it up. In the ask levels, there were three choices: $25, $35, or $50. And this is a place where we do a lot of work. And he came back and said, I feel disrespected. I feel unknown. This is almost insulting. And actually said, if it was $1,000, $2,500, $5,000, I might have given $2,500, but I'm not going to give $25. And it just really went the wrong way. Which, Linda, that's why having some data around this and being more targeted and using wealth capacity is huge.
Absolutely. A lot of times when we're working with potential clients on the front end, one of our salespeople will bring me or one of my colleagues in to take a look at a test file that a client has provided. And often we are taking a look at the kind of cherry-picked large donor file as opposed to maybe the annual fund or membership file. And almost always what we're seeing is the people with the highest capacity are in that annual fund file giving small regular amounts. And they can't, the organization can't figure out why they can't get these other people off the dime with major giving, and they're probably giving at close to their max capacity at this point. So they would be much better, bringing up in their giving the people who really are potential major donors and then getting them moved over into portfolios.
And with today's technology, it's pretty easy to run analytics to create segments to understand the different factors behind the prospects. And then there's all kinds of print technologies now where you can customize even folded 4-color pieces. So They can have customized messaging around the person's interest area. And then the ask amounts can be customized to the person. So it is no longer the day of where you got to do a 20,000 run of the same thing. You can do runs of 10s and 30s and 300s, and you're doing 20,000 pieces, but it's all broken up into these subsets by interest area and ask level. So it's a very different day than just a few years ago. And unfortunately, not a lot of people stay on the left side and keep doing the same old, and it's causing the situation we've been using as the case example here. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's look at a top line focus here. So here's a revenue curve. So we see this. This is pretty good, solid top line growth. But there's two factors underneath, which is how many gifts are coming in and what's the average gift size. And so when you look at this, and let's click quickly at that one. On the right, the good news is there's clearly a high-end annual focus and a nice increase in gift size. So on the axis, the gift had been $112. Now it's up to $337 average. But the problem is, as they drove up the gift size and the revenue went up, they lost the focus on the participation. So on the left, the donors are actually down by a third in 5 years. So this helps if you're trying to grow revenue, but if you're actually trying to cultivate and build in new donors and do the things we talked about earlier, this is bad. Top right, the issue is out of this, as you end up with weak and declining participation. That's the combination. So you're actually getting more money from fewer donors, but you're not building this pipeline. So this is where just the top line can really be misleading. And so this would be an example of a non-strategic metric because just the top line by itself doesn't go far enough. What we really want to look at is a set of like 5 strategic metrics, which we recommend, and they can help you really build a more vibrant program. So the first of these is participation. I mean, are we growing our donor base over time? The next one is, do we retain our donors? Once we acquire a donor, how good of a job are we doing at keeping him or her? When donors lapse, do we succeed in getting them back? So typically, we can run ratios on these things. Like if you have current donors, say it's a bar, and there's another bar, which is lapsed donors, you want to see the current donors typically be 1.2, 1.5 or more of the lapsed donors. You want it to be bigger. We'll often come into an account and we'll see that the lapsed donors may be 1.5, sometimes 2 times the current donors, which what that means is this team is doing a great job, or they're doing a good job of acquiring donors, but then they let them lapse. And the problem is the longer they lapse, the more they become like non-donors. Like if they've gone 1 or 2 years, they're pretty easy to reacquire. But if they're lapsed, 3 or 4 years, they basically look like a non-donor from every statistic we've ever seen. So it's not enough just to acquire. You also need to then focus on retaining, and we'll look at this a little bit more in a minute. Third measure is appeals. Not all appeals do the same thing. And so is our messaging connecting with our constituents? Are we using the right media to reach them? Are our asks at the right levels? And this is measurable because you can attach gifts either because they coded the appeal or because they come in with a certain time after the appeal, clearly triggered by the appeal. They might have come into the website, but the appeal triggered them. But our best practices and our top performers study the appeals, and if it's donor acquisition, they're looking carefully at which appeals had the highest yield at acquiring this type of non-donor. And then, often we'll see a spread where 20%, 10% of the appeals are doing most of the acquisition, and then there's another 80% that do very little. They keep getting sent, and they can be expensive pieces, but they're not actually causing a benefit. And that's where we suggest experimenting. I mean, there might be a purpose for these appeals that aren't bringing gifts in, but you want to be very careful with them. And we often see the same portfolio of appeals going out, time and time again, instead of trying to understand what did these 10 do differently than these other 65. And when we get that, can we do more and boost what's going on in these 10 or 15? The next one is touch points. We often see, back to this, hitting everybody with generic messages. Are we soliciting at the right frequency? We have a lot of examples of clients who take, especially non-donors, and barrage, I would use the word barrage, almost harass with emails, where they're getting 50 to 70 solicitation touches a year. This is real. And the problem with that is I was actually at an account For those of you that know me, I'm from Boston. I love the Boston Red Sox, but they were doing this to me. They were hitting me with too many emails, and I opted out. And I said, I love the Boston Red Sox, but I opted out. If you hit your people with 50 to 70 touch points, they're going to start opting out. And the stats that we've run, and we do a bunch of them, shows that 6 to 12 well-timed, effective appeals is far better than 50 to 70, and it's going to cost you less money and produce more results. Then the last one, and this is the average gift size. And there's actually two parts to this. One stated here: are our donors giving more over time? Essentially, as they mature, their capacity should go up. They're more engaged because they've been giving consistently. Presumably, they also start coming to events, and then that should grow. And the other side of this is the average gift size should be tracked in relationship to the capacity and engagement. And the more capacity, the more engaged they are, the more they should give. So there's sort of two parts to that. But really, it's are we growing our base? Are we retaining them? Are our appeals connecting with people and succeeding? And let's tune the ones that aren't. Making sure we've got the right frequencies and making sure we're looking at the giving levels relative to the capacity, engagement, and trending over time. Linda, feel free to jump in and add some more of this, but this is what we see, is really helping build good programs.
Yeah, and what I often see is the bottom line for an annual appeal is, did we make our goal? And the first thing that I want to ask is, what was your goal based on? Was it based on need? Was it based on a shortfall you're experiencing this year? And is your goal actually, quote, doable, right? And I couldn't say amen loud enough in my head to what you were saying about the barraging with solicitations. I mean, we don't want to be guilty of spamming people when we are reaching out to them online. And, that can lead to a drop in donor retention.
Right. And it could drive.
Yeah, it drives people away.
Right.
And that's the reverse of what we want to do.
And often we see as people, senior management may get those points, but then often there's inertia to change, which is one of the things we're going to touch in a minute. Why doesn't everybody quickly move over and do these kinds of things? And there's challenges to it. Drilling a little bit deeper on participation, this is another one of these things where, top line, this is an organization. It's disguised data from one of our clients. By the way, it's participation in the 40s, a caveat at the bottom. This is a mature program with high participation. Newer programs will be substantially lower. It's a trend line that we're focusing on here. This is often, a lot of our clients would be 10, 20%, not 47, 44. But if you look at this, it's pretty good. That's 2016. This is data from a couple of years ago. It's not yet completed. So, that's a year, let's say it's April, because it's going to pop up. So that's actually pretty good. But when we drill into this, there's sub-stories to it. And on the left, we've got the retention of current donors, which is actually fine. I mean, it's been stable. So we acquire a donor. Are they there the next year? And it's roughly 78% of them are. This year's not done yet, so I'm not worried about that. The middle one is when we lapse a donor. They lapse 1 year. Do we reacquire them the next year? This is actually bad and going down. So the target is 65%. It peaked in 13. And it's been consistently dropping. So if I'm looking at this program, the top line doesn't show that there's an erosion here. Then when the people on the left lapse, I'm doing an increasingly bad job of reacquiring them, which over time is going to cause a problem, because if these people lapse not 1 year, but now it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they basically fall back in the non-donor pool from a behavioral standpoint and are much harder to get back. And eventually that's going to pull that participation rate down. Then on the right, I'm looking at this chart.
It already is doing, if we can see that, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's actually what's pulled it down the last couple of years.
Right.
And this non-donor thing on the right, it's actually been okay. We're trying to have so we want to put metrics on these things. We want to acquire 4% of our non-donor pool every year. That's an aggressive target. But this year is almost done, and it's horrible. So if I was this organization, there's a couple of clear focuses here, and go back to those strategic metrics. I would want to try to figure out which appeals actually have been retaining my donors, which appeals have been acquiring my non-donors, and let's start experimenting a little bit, because we clearly don't want these sub-level trends to continue, or that top line is going to continue to erode and get below the 40% target. And then on the non-donors,
did the messaging change starting in, say, 2013, 2014, to start driving down that silent reacquisition? That would be something I would be asking.
Exactly. Or was there a change in the team or a change in philosophy? Mm-hmm. Something shifted, because that's a pretty dramatic,
big time,
change. Anytime you see a dramatic change like that, it's worthwhile going back and trying to untangle what the causal factors were, what caused it, and what can we then do about it. Yep. In the non-donor side, one of the things we totally recommend there is segmenting the non-donors, which is the next page here, because you want to study the recently acquired non-donors. So you had a pool of non-donors. Some of them were acquired, some of them weren't. Who are the ones that were acquired? What are their characteristics? Who else has similar characteristics? And this lends itself to predictive modeling. It's exactly what it does. So this pie chart, there's a third that look like our donors, and the ones on the right, generally different age groups, so it'll be different characteristics. For graduates, less than 5 years in this case, and this is disguised data from one of our clients. They're women. They live in New York. They have certain degrees. These degrees presumably got them better jobs. And so they've been connected and been giving. And for the graduates older than 5 years, they're married, they live in Virginia, Texas, New York, have professional degrees, and they've been attending events. And there's a weighted score. The modeling would figure out how these things combine between events and degrees and where they live, and to create a score for people who look like our non-donors. And then, by creating this out of above, who were recently acquired and how do they compare with everybody else, you can then score the whole population. Typically, we find that about a third of the non-donors look like the recently acquired donors. A third have some of those characteristics that might give, and a third won't give. And we had one client who took this thing, and they actually ended up sending a third less mail pieces because they stopped sending them to the purple and the green part of this pie. They sent them only to the people who look like their donors. So they cut their mailings down, but they then added in some other pieces with it. And then they were able to get the touch points on the blue circle higher with appropriate messaging, and they tripled their revenue. So it was an experiment. There's a lot of resistance because people said, hey, we have to mail everybody because we've got to connect with everybody. And this one person took a bold step and said, no, we're going to send to 1/3 of this population. We're going to cut down our total mailing. We're going to augment it maybe with some phone calls, and I bet we'll get more revenue. And she tripled the revenue. That's awesome. And then you've got this base coming in, and you grow them over time. So that's what segmenting does.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's where it works. So the ask amounts, and this is the whole idea of capacity we often observe. And here's a case from one of our clients, and it's similar to the story we talked about earlier. Alums from classes in 70s who live in wealthy communities, so their power hours of their career, they give the same as everybody else. In this case, the average was $150 average gift size. And we challenged this client. Why? Why are the people who clearly have wealth, who are in the 70s and 80s, and this is like a dinner out somewhere, paying $150, which is the same as the 3-year out recent graduates? This makes no sense. So we said, why don't you you get these people screened, or even if they're not screened, just match in wealth by zip, do something simple, but start differentiating your messaging, because you're leaving a ton of money on the table. These people should be able to give far more than $150. Why not 1,500 or 2,000 average gift sizes for them? Keep the young alums at 150, but boost these people up. And that's the value of bringing in capacity information and segmenting and using these modern mail and approaches to customize your messages so this doesn't happen, because you could have a nice top line trend in participation, but now you're leaving what, $1,000 a person on the table here. Why not get it? And then we get into, why doesn't everybody fix this? Well, the problem is there's established programs. We run this all the time. Most of the programs have been running for a while. The teams are used to looking at things a certain way, and that may not highlight strategic issues. And then the next one is there's tons of data. untangling what worked and what didn't can often be challenging. Well, that's where like firms like Wealth Engine and us could come in. We can help you untangle this. And, you know, Advisor puts systems in that once we untangle it, they load in front of your CRM and untangle this data every day so you can get at it. And often there's no wealth screening. It's hard to determine what to ask from whom. And, you know, ideally you wealth screen people because it's better information, but if you can't wealth screen, don't have the budget, at least bring in some wealth by zip code or some metrics so you don't have everybody, you know, given $150 when they live in wealthy zip codes and they're prime earners in their career. You can also bring in proxies from employment, like match out on titles, and people with C-level jobs in larger companies who live in wealthy zips and have capacity, yikes, raise the ask amount.
Yep, raise the bar.
Raise the bar. And the last one, we see this, resistance to change. So we'll come in that case where the one woman decided not to send the messaging to everybody, but cut it just to that blue part of the pie. There was resistance. People pushed back. There's old habits, there's patterns, there's inertia, there's fear. There's fear that my job is to send this to everybody, and if I don't send it to everybody, my job isn't valuable, or people will go crazy. Teams are used to established programs. Some team members can fear for their jobs if less is sent. And so when we study and we ask, why do people not do these things more strategically, it's usually these kinds of cultural things that come up, and strong leadership or one person who can like change the game, like that case with the woman who cut the mail pieces back and tripled the revenue. That's contagious. If you do that and it works, and just try experiments and then repeat the experiments, you know, you can get the thing going and everybody goes, awesome, this is a much better way to do this. So I'm going to stop now and turn over to Linda, but this stuff, if I have one message here, is just try stuff and remember that there is going to be resistance and there's going to be pushback, but if you don't try it, you'll never get to better performance. Yeah,
I mean, I think fear, and you cited fear, Doug. I think fear is very often the underlying motivation, as well as sometimes I'm going to have to work harder. I already work really hard. How hard do I have to work to make this change happen? We're understaffed, right? But what if you could work smarter rather than hard nuts and the gumption to stand up to the status quo and mail to only that third who looked the most like the best donors. I mean, yeah, that probably would have cost her job if she'd failed, but she was courageous enough to recognize it wasn't going to cost her job, and she was willing to take the risk. So kudos to her.
Agreed.
Okay, well, thank you, Doug. Those are awesome comments, and you know, obviously not your first rodeo doing this. Very, very helpful information. So how do we get to the execution part? And I'm not talking about, you know, Marie Antoinette coming to the guillotine by any stretch of the imagination, but rather moving forward expeditiously. It's basically year-end mailing season now. We've got Giving Tuesday coming up. We've got all of the state and regional Gives Days coming up. And then after that, we've got those year-end mail drops coming up. It is not, and you would be surprised at the disrepair that we often see when we get a mailing list in or a database pull in from a client. The second thing is to mine the fat middle, and we all know that our middles tend to get fatter during the holidays, but this means something else that we'll get into a little bit later. And then, as Doug says, you want to right-size your ask, you want to determine your goal, you want to keep it simple. One of the worst things you can do is overthink this stuff. And then remember that stewardship matters. So let's take a look. It's the holidays, so we're going to make our list and check it twice, right? Just like Santa tells us to do. So the first thing is take a look at your data. Is that data being entered consistently? Is it accurately? Is it accurate? I am consistently amazed at how many different naming patterns are used, how many street, a city, if we're spelling out place, road, boulevard, or if we're having it in all caps with no punctuation. All of these things matter because when it spits out your mailing list, we want it to look professional. We want it to look good, right? And let's see if the salutation fields are being populated properly. You don't want to see Dr. John Jones, PhD, or, Dr. John Jones, MD. It's either Dr. John Jones or it's John Jones, MD or PhD. I know that sounds nitpicky, but believe me, people notice this stuff. And then check about your giving history, because very often we see files that maybe the first gift amount is populated and the last gift amount is populated, but then the largest gift amount is not populated, and we have then a total giving amount that's way out of whack. So it's just going to help you with your metrics, and it's going to help you if you get a well screening to make sure that history is correct. And then what are you doing about your return mail and email bounce backs? There's so many times that I've gotten databases in, and we take a look at it and it'll say bad address, but they still were submitting it to us. So if you don't have that address, we've got solutions for you to help you get the right address and the right email. Believe it or not, running spell check is a great idea, because sometimes you'd be embarrassed to know that you might be spelling a Michael incorrectly. And believe me, your end user, your potential donor, is going to notice that, and they're going to feel just a soupçon of insult when they see that. You mean they don't know me well enough how to spell my name, right?
Hey,
so
Linda, I just have to say something on the salutation field. So I will often get mailings, it's Dear Douglas. And as soon as I see it, the only person in my life who's ever called me Douglas was my mom when she was really mad at me. So that's just the key, that somebody doesn't know me. This is just some blast mail coming in.
Yeah. Now, once you take a look at that audit and see, and this is especially true if you've got volunteers who are doing data entry, or if you're a university and you've got work-study students who are doing data entry, you need to make sure that they are doing this correctly. And I would really consider creating an internal data style book. And we've got a data-driven annual campaign workbook that has got a lot of information in there about that. You can find that under the Resources tab on the Wealth Engine homepage, and it's a free download. So that list, though, another things that we should do is run national change of address regularly. Now, most of you are thinking, no, duh, but believe it or not, there's a lot of people who either don't know what NCOA is, or they don't do it regularly. They don't even realize that their mail house might be able to do it for them. So definitely do that. And if your mail house can't or won't, we can actually help. Now, there's about 10 to 20% are going to move during any given year, okay? We've got this product, We Clean, and you'll get the NCOA, plus you'll get additional email addresses and all the phone numbers that are available out there, as well as a flag that will indicate if somebody has passed away. And, there's a number of people who pass away, unfortunately, every year. So you don't want to be rubbing salt on the wounds of the survivor by soliciting, Mr. Jones when Mrs. Jones is sitting at home lonely and with a broken heart, grieving her lost husband. So the other, plus side is you're going to be saving a bunch of money on return mail and print overages by doing this. So, just pennies a record is we clean. Okay, I mentioned that middle. I should cringe when I say that with Thanksgiving coming up, but nonetheless, we're not talking about the freshman 15. We're talking about your middle donors, and they generally make up between 10 in any file. This group is so often ignored. So customize their appeal as well. As Doug was talking about, for those wealthier people, you want to segment your database, and you don't want to ignore this middle group because they tend to be very sustainable. You want to personalize everything that you can. And again, to Doug's point, you don't want to say Douglas if they go by Doug, or Margaret if they go by Peggy, right? And then again, don't ask for that same old amount, that 25, 35, or 50. Well, of course, you're going to get the same result as you did last year. What was it Einstein said about doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different outcome? That's the definition of insanity. So let's not be insane. Let's upgrade the ask based on the last gift amount, and then you can use our estimated annual donation range, which is one of our proprietary Wealth Engine scores, to also give you some additional intel about what they are giving away overall in a single year. So to right size that ask, we're looking at 3 bands that you can figure out by either Doug's suggested metrics, or if you're a Wealth Engine customer and you are screening and looking up your people, I think your high capacity band would be primarily your P2G1s with a handful of your higher capacity P2G2s who are actually giving. And you want to take a look at those people who are at 100,000 plus. Now, if you've got a really huge constituency group, you can sub-segment that by, say, 300,000 plus capacity, or even 1 million plus capacity. Now, for your existing donors in this band, let's just surprise them. Let's spice it up and ask them for 5 times the last gift amount. And then take a look at the first gift amount of your high capacity donors so that you can ask your prospects for a reasonable and so on across the mid-level. That would be those with capacity of 25K to 100K. So we're saying 3 times the last gift amount, and then the same protocol, average first gift in the mid-level capacity band. And then for those everyday givers, those folks who have capacity of under 25K, let's just shake them up a little bit. And if they're giving $15 last year, let's ask them for 30. Why not? And then same protocol for the non-donors. Any thoughts about that, Doug? I guess not.
Yeah, so
okay.
So I was going to just jump in there. Sorry, I put myself on mute. I was going to say totally support what you're saying here. And there's also, all of you have enough data to do something around these lines. Scoring everybody and getting full detail is the best. If you can't, analytic tools like us can cut the population into pieces so you get part of it scored to get the depth. And there's proxies like, Wealthy Zip is not as accurate as a wealth screening, but if it's all you've got, I would say use it to get something going. And then once you get populations, get them wealth screened and start creating these buckets like this. But I would say, don't not do this. There's a whole bunch of ways of doing this, and it makes a huge difference. And it's almost, in my view, criminal if you've got like everybody giving $150 average, and you've got these radically different subsegments of your population, and clearly they should not all be giving the same. So I think it's on everybody to figure out how to do this better and get the performance levels up. And applaud what you're doing here, Linda.
And likewise, I think another proxy could be largest gift of $1,000 or largest gift of $5,000. If you've got anybody who's done that, they would be the people that could fill in for high capacity. And I think anybody who can give, 25 to 50, that would probably be your low, and so on and so forth. So there's different ways to slice and dice it, but of course, we do encourage you to screen your data. So you need to determine your goal, and you should be determining your goal when you're doing your annual fundraising plan, not fly by the seat of your pants, of course, and just say, oh, hey, I think we need to raise 75K by the end of the year because we're coming in short. So year-end fundraising is not a crapshoot. I think a lot of us know that, but sometimes we behave differently. So one thing I really recommend is that you use a capital campaign type of approach and come up with your goal and then build a gift table and then plug in the prospects to that gift table who could make those gifts. So you're going to have to identify basically an annual fund lead gift. So is it $5,000? Is it $10,000? And then build out the goal sequentially, largest gift first. This will go back to that idea of segmentation by bands, or if you use us, by P2G score. And you can then populate that gift table and do this on a much strategic basis. You can use that last gift amount, you can use estimated giving capacity, you can use the P2G score, and you can also use estimated annual donations for additional insight. Now, is your goal feasible, or is this something that somebody just kind of came up with as a whim, or just kind of a, yeah, we raised this last year, so we should be able to raise it this year? So we actually have, you can download a gift table calculator right here, this URL, and play around with this and see if you actually have the number of people at the right capacity to meet that goal. And if not, you can change your goal. You could make it larger, or you could right size it to be a little bit less. Finally, keep it simple. You know, as Doug said, you have to experiment and you have to test to see what messaging resonates with your donors. And certain things, a couple of years ago, who they did some screening and modeling with us, and was working with them closely in my consulting role at Wealth Engine. And their first spring appeal out of the chute, after we worked together to pull out a list for the mailing based on scores and modeling and so on, had, you won't believe this, a 58% lift. We almost died. I remember her telling me that, and I literally jumped out of my desk chair. I was so excited. But the next spring, it was the same exact lift as she had had before. It wasn't 58%. It was back down to average. And I looked at it, and I looked at the data, and I finally came back to her, and I asked, what was the messaging about? Well, rather than being a highly compelling message, and it actually was concerning the refugee crisis, that really pushed people's resonated emotionally. This was an appeal for their general operating fund. That's the buzzer. It wasn't very successful, and I think they learned that. The other thing is, you need to be reminded to write to the donor. Don't just be singing the praises of your organization, even though you've done great work. You want to tell them what it is, the impact that they are having. And you want to personalize this not just with their name, but by using the word you. I think you've seen that in a lot of good direct mail. And then, of course, tell at least one story that puts a face on, your cause. The impact of your donors' giving is helping people like this. And then, obviously, a sense of urgency. We talk about having a sense of urgency very often when we're in a major gifts campaign. But we need a sense of urgency for the annual fund, too. We need to include a call to action with that ask amount, and we need to ask to send it in by a specified date. Otherwise, human nature is, it's very easy to put it aside on your desk, and then you put your notebook on top of the appeal, and then 2 weeks go later, and all of a sudden it's January 3rd, you clean off your desk and you go, oh no. Well, maybe I'm the only person that happens to, but I really don't think so.
No, that happens to me too, Linda, all the time. I can totally relate.
So make the donor the hero of the story. That's really the bottom line. Tom Ahern, for those of you who haven't ever heard of him, and I can't imagine who you would be, he is a donor communications specialist. He speaks all over the world, actually, and this is his key takeaway: make the donor the hero. That's how you keep them, that's how you acquire them, and it's how you build loyalty. And then finally, don't forget stewardship. Stewardship is key to donor retention as well. So don't just plan for the ask, but let's think about what we're going to do for the rest of the year to steward donors. So I would really recommend that you go ahead and, looking towards next year, put together a donor communication plan and look at messaging and look at some benchmarks for acknowledgement. So here's a suggested plan. It's just in a chart, but it just gives you an idea of daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. You can put these in your calendar with reminders, and it may seem obviously simple, but I have worked with organizations that would only send out gift acknowledgements once a month to every 6 weeks. And boy, that got changed really quick. And it also had a very positive impact on donor retention and donor happiness. So that's it for me. Do you have anything more, Doug, that you would like to say about the points I've made, or?
Well, I just say, yeah, what I love about this is, we're an analytics company that sells software that runs on top of systems, so you can do these segmentations and figure out the touch point stuff. And I love what you guys are doing with the, and bringing in outside information that's critical to the story and helping execute these programs. And it's a really cool, that we can work together on these things. And I love the back and forth. I'd also say, if some of you are coming to the AASP show in Chicago next week, we're having a session on taking these concepts and how do you actually execute them with mailings and customization, the actual print part of it, getting it out. And we also have some of our clients will be there talking about how they've done this, how they work with Wealth Engine, how they've the woman I mentioned who tripled the revenue by sending less is going to be there talking. And you can get at it, www.growthofgiving.com, www.growthofgiving.com, or just, you've got my email up here. Just if you can stay after the AASP, it's Wednesday afternoon in Chicago. It'll be a great follow on to this and get a little more tactical about how to make these things happen.
Great. So Rebecca, do we have any questions from our audience?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys very much for a great discussion. At this time, I want to remind everybody that you are welcome to submit your questions to the question and answer box, and we do have a handful of questions to get us started. So
awesome.
Can you talk a little bit about what you guys would consider a lapsed donor? Is it 1 year, 3 years, 5 years?
Yeah, let me start with that. So that varies. and there's a variety of definitions, so we'll work with different ones. But what we recommend is a current donor is somebody who gave in the last complete fiscal year. So I'm going to jump in if there's different views of this, I know. But for us, that would be if the fiscal year was June 30th, 2017. If they gave in that year, they'd be a current donor. A lapsed donor would be somebody who gave in one of the years before that, but not 2017. And then you've got another issue if they already given this year, but that would ride on top of it. So you have this snapshot of people, and then a lapsed donor could have lapsed, 1 year, like they didn't give in 17, but they gave in 16, or it could have been 2 years, they gave in 15, but not 16 or 17, or they could have lapsed 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So we generally want to track back the lapsed donors, how long they've been lapsed for. And the current donors, we also want to look at how long they've been a current donor, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 5 years plus. Those segments make very big differences on behavior, and you want to do different things with them. But that's our recommended definitions.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is if you've got annual donors and they haven't yet made a gift in 2017, I wouldn't call them lapsed if their last gift was in 2016, right? So not to quibble with Doug, but I would just say consider that if you've got a large chunk of your database who only give one time a year, and a lot of organizations do. Other than that, my belief is if you've lost somebody for 2 years, they're going to be harder to reacquire. And if you've lost somebody for 3 years, they're gone. They're toast. They're like a non-donor. So I think we're pretty much in concert there.
Yeah, I would agree. And I actually think we have roughly the same definition. I'd say one other thing with the current donors that's important, but not always looked at, is what's their consistent season of giving. So some people, if they've given all the last 3 years in November and December, that's the time to solicit them. Other people have been given in May and June, and other people give more variably. But that's important because if you have a 5-year consecutive donor and it's March, and they've given consistently in November and December, but they missed this current December, those would be prime targets to pick up and reacquire before they lapse further, because they've got a clear pattern. And we totally recommend, in addition to this current lapse thing and how many years, if they're current, what's their consistency season of giving?
Absolutely. And it wouldn't be beyond reason to be able to send them a little device that maybe said, we missed you, when they haven't donated that 1 year. Now, you don't know, perhaps there was a family crisis, perhaps there was an illness, perhaps they were away traveling. So that might be a reminder for them and a nudge for them to go ahead and make that gift that they ordinarily made at the end of the year in the spring. And that'll simply help move things forward for that particular calendar year.
Great. Thank you, guys. Another question. So what type of response rate is typical for renewals and lapsed and very long lapsed donors? Also, response rate for acquisition, as well as what would you consider a good or average retention rate?
Yeah, so let me go, and then Linda, you can add on. So generally retention rates, good would be 70% over, okay would be 50 to 70%, under 50% we'd be suspect of. Then the appeal targets, so that varies between current donors reacquiring short lapsed versus long lapsed and acquiring non-donors. Generally, an appeal for current donors, a good one's going to be 2 to 5%. Over 5%, usually it's a really small appeal that was very, very targeted. But, so 2 to 5% would be our range, much under 2%, look at it for current donors. Similarly for short lapse donors, because they look a lot like current donors. For long lapse donors and non-donors, anything over 1% is good. We're typically seeing 0.5% yield. This would be numbers of donors to numbers of appeals sent. over 0.5% for non-donors and long-lapse donors is good. You get up 1 to 2%, which we see, that's really, really, really good. Those are the numbers we typically see.
Yeah, and I think that across the country, we are seeing that donor retention rates are dropping precipitously. AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, put out, every year they put out their fundraising effectiveness survey report. And I believe they said that over the last 10 years, donor retention rates have been averaging at below 50%, which is really sad. So what are we doing wrong, and how do we include that? So, or improve that, excuse me. Clearly something is happening that isn't good if the retention rate is that low. And I don't know if it is a short attention span, if it is poor stewardship, if it's people being besieged by asks. I think it's maybe a combination thereof. And to Doug's point, with if you're above 1%, you're doing well. So what you really need to be kind of looking at is, with the acquisition, is did you retain them? And then can we kind of figure out what the lifetime value of that donor will be if we keep them?
Great, thank you guys. And a few questions on touch points. So when we're talking about avoiding too many touches per year, would that include invitations to events? And would it include follow-up acknowledgement emails for example, recurring monthly donations?
In our world, yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. In our world, we would take solicitation touches, and our recommendation is between 6 and 12. Now, in addition, there's going to be, alumni event mailings, and there may be thank you notes and other stuff coming from the institution. But our 6 to 12 is solicitation touches, and it's in a moving 12-month period.
Right. So one of is getting a monthly receipt for a monthly gift. I am, for instance, a sustaining member of my local public radio station. They do not send a monthly receipt. They send a year-end receipt, and that's how I think it should be done. But I support somebody who is working overseas on a monthly basis. Doggone it, every month in my email box, there's that receipt. And I feel like going, you are wasting time and resources sending me that receipt. Just send me the receipt at the end of the year. So I'm going a little bit beyond the question that was asked and saying, rethink that strategy, because you may be burning time, and what's worse is you may be irritating your donors. A monthly donor knows that's coming out. Let's just acknowledge them at the year end for tax purposes.
Great. Thank you, guys. Probably have time for one more question.
Pick a good one. Sorry.
So maybe sort of a broad one. How can organizations best use and implement the results of a wealth screening to drive annual giving?
Well, here is one of the things where I am going to be shamelessly promoting Wealth Engine. And I think that the best thing that you can do is invest in some professional services hours. If you really want to make your screening results actionable across all of your fundraising, because we can provide you with input, segmentation, and best practices results, as well as next steps, starting with major giving and even including planned giving, and definitely looking at the annual fund and annual giving. So that's That's my strong recommendation.
And from my perspective, of this discussion about getting the right ask levels, and it's part of also for the non-donor segmentation is going to be a factor in there. It's untangling who's your most valuable prospects and making sure you're getting the right amounts from it. It's hugely valuable across the board.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. So that's all the time that we have today. I want to remind you that the recording and the slides from the webinar will be sent out within 24 hours. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.